The subject of today's video ruled Cambodia for only 4 years, yet in that time he plunged the country into chaos. In a bid to create a communist utopia, Pol Pot was responsible for the deaths of 2 million people. This was quarter of Cambodia's population at the time. In today's video, we will look at the rise of Pol Pot, his infamous regime, and how he actually evaded justice. Saloth Sar, or otherwise known as his moniker Pol Pot, was born on the 25th of May 1925 in the small village of Preek Sabu. He came from a relatively well-off family. His father was a wealthy farmer with land and cattle. He grew up in a modest home, received a good education, and was raised as a Buddhist. As a child, he would assist in the running of the farm and would spend time enjoying the rural life typical of many Cambodians. At the time of his birth, Cambodia was under French colonial rule. When he was 10, Saloth Sar was sent to live with his wealthy relatives and attended a private school attended by the elite of Cambodia and the children of French colonialists. His family had ties to the ruling monarch of Cambodia, and the young Saloth Sar would even spend time at the royal palace. In 1945, Saloth Sar left Cambodia and he travelled to France. His privileged position meant that he was selected to attend a private engineering school in Paris. It was during this time that he would first encounter Marxism, the political ideology that would shape his future and Cambodia's future. He joined a Marxist reading group established by other Cambodian students. He attended French Communist Party meetings and began reading the works of Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. He preferred Stalin's work to Marx's. He didn't fully understand Marx's writings, but instead he was drawn to Stalin's works on how a country can transition to socialism and reorganize its economy. But arguably, Mao Zedong was the one who inspired Saloth Sar the most, especially Mao's work on New Democracy. This text set out a framework for revolution in colonial and feudal societies, just like Cambodia. Saloth Sar was drawn to Mao's philosophy of agrarian revolution, believing that a true communist society could only be built through the overthrow of urban elites and the return to rural agricultural traditions. This vision would become the foundation of the Khmer Rouge movement. In 1953, Saloth Sar travelled to Saigon in Vietnam. There he joined the Viet Minh, a communist movement that sought independence from French colonial rule. The Viet Minh organized not only the Vietnamese to fight against colonial rule, but also those in neighboring countries, and Saloth Sar joined one such group, though he soon became disillusioned. French colonial forces were eventually beaten and driven from Cambodia, and the new nationalist government was led by King Sihanouk, and he arranged for the Viet Minh forces in Cambodia to leave. In the following elections, the socialists were beaten, but for Saloth Sar, the fight was not over. Underground and secret meetings were held to grow support for communism, whilst the new government cracked down on any movement that sought to undermine it. By day he worked as a teacher, and by night their manifesto for remaking Cambodia was drafted. In 1959, Saloth Sar and his closest comrades formed the Khmer Rouge. It's at this point that he adopted the moniker Pol Pot. Pol Pot would come to take over the party when the leader was murdered by government forces. In 1963, in the face of growing crackdowns on the party, Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge fled into the jungles on the Vietnam-Cambodia border. There, they settled with the guerrilla fighters of the Viet Minh. From these jungle camps, Vietnamese forces would launch attacks against American forces in their country. Retaliatory bombing campaigns by the Americans would claim thousands of lives. These attacks contributed to many Cambodians to join the Khmer Rouge. The party gained popularity amongst the rural populations, establishing camps ready to wage war against King Sihanouk's government. But life in these camps was extremely brutal. New recruits were broken in. This was done with imprisonment and forced to seek forgiveness for any wrongdoings. Before too long, Pol Pot developed close ties with Communist China, visiting Beijing and witnessing the Cultural Revolution in full swing. In addition to ideological support, the Chinese supplied Pol Pot with plenty of weapons, and by 1968, Pol Pot launched his attack on Sihanouk's government. and so began the Cambodian Civil War. The initial stages of this war focused on obtaining weapons, supplies, and spreading propaganda. With only a few thousand members, any attempt to take control would need wider support. Sihanouk developed closer ties with the Americans, who intensified their bombing campaigns. However, in 1970, Sihanouk was overthrown by a military coup led by General Lon Nol. Sihanouk in turn looked to the Khmer Rouge as a potential ally, bringing with him more fighters and a sense of legitimacy to the communists. Throughout the early 1970s, the Cambodian Civil War intensified as both sides engaged in increasingly violent acts. The Khmer Rouge, from its stronghold in rural areas, launched ambushes, sabotage, and assassinations against the Cambodian military. Pol Pot expanded his revolutionary bases in the countryside and increased recruitment from the peasantry. He promised them a better life, free from all exploitation. The rural population, suffering from government neglect and the effects of US bombing campaigns, was particularly open to his message. Pol Pot soon developed a cult of personality amongst his new members, taking lead from Stalin and Mao. By 1973, the Khmer Rouge had become a formidable military force, and they began to threaten the capital, Phnom Penh. The nationalist government, despite receiving support from the US, was starting to struggle. Lon Nol's government was losing ground in the face of the Khmer Rouge's guerrilla warfare tactics and widespread popular support. The situation was exacerbated by the collapse of the South Vietnamese government and the withdrawal of the US forces from Vietnam. With the Khmer Rouge in control of much of the country, their next goal was to capture the capital of Phnom Penh. On the 17th of April, 1975, the military government surrendered, and the Khmer Rouge took over the capital. Pol Pot declared that today marked Day Zero in the new state of Democratic Kampuchea, and this is where the true horrors began. Once in control of the city, Pol Pot immediately ordered the evacuation of the entire city of Phnom Penh. Under the pretense of an imminent American air raid, everyone was told to leave. Government officials, police officers, soldiers, and religious leaders were all murdered when the city was first captured. This was usually carried out with blunt force trauma to the back of the head. Bullets were a luxury that the Khmer Rouge could not waste, but the horrors in Phnom Penh would just be the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of people were dragged from their homes and from hospitals. Those that refused were killed. All the trappings of city life, anything that marked them from the city, was stripped from them as they were marched into the jungles. They would begin new lives, working on Khmer Rouge farms or working as labourers in massive infrastructure projects. Pol Pot believed that the city was a symbol of corruption, and in order to create his perfect society, all citizens would need to return to the countryside. Urbanization, education, and modernity were all seen as enemies of his ideal communist society. Everyone was to be equal, a peasant toiling in the fields. Though in reality there was absolutely no equality. Former city dwellers were treated with suspicion. They would receive less food than others, and would be watched constantly by the Khmer Rouge overseers. For those who had fought through the Civil War, these new workers, former city dwellers, were previously seen as the enemy. Under Pol Pot's rule, Cambodia descended into a nightmare. Over the course of the next few years, nearly 2 million people, which was a quarter of the population at the time, were brutally killed. These victims, most of whom were civilians, were either executed or died from starvation, disease, and forced labour. This forced labour was largely done on government-owned farmland. Pol Pot believed that achieving a self-sufficient agrarian society would not only protect the country from outside interference, but also transform the people to be the perfect communists through hard work. Life for these people was beyond brutal. The new regime calculated that production of rice needed to increase threefold to 3 tons of rice per hectare. The goal was to create enough food to not only feed the population, but to sell the surpluses to fund a communist and industrial revolution without the need for modernity. This was a ridiculous target, and one that was never going to be achieved, especially by people who had never even worked on land before. Living off meagre rations, as little as 250 grams of rice a day, the population was slowly starved to death as they were forced to attempt to create a self-sufficient state. When these farms inevitably failed to meet quotas, Pol Pot used extreme repression to eliminate those he believed to be sabotaging his utopia. Individuality was seen as a threat to his regime. Parents were not allowed to raise their own young children. Rather, they were to be cared for by the commune as a whole. The state would decide who you could marry and when, and any unsanctioned relationships were dealt with by public execution. Anyone not considered living the peasant life would be branded as enemies of the state, including doctors, teachers, and the educated. It is often stated that simply wearing glasses was enough for the Khmer Rouge to sentence you to death. Rather, it would be looking for any sign that the person was not from the peasant class. Glasses could be an indicator, but so too could be soft hands with no signs of manual labour. And in true communist hypocrisy, Pol Pot himself wore glasses and was well educated. The average citizen could find themselves a prisoner for the most banal of reasons: eating at an incorrect time, failing to meet a production quota, or being suspected of being an agent for some foreign spy agency, seeking to destroy all of Pol Pot's hard work. For those who were deemed to be criminals or traitors, the destination would be the infamous prisons, such as S21. S21 has to be one of the most insanely cruel prisons of all time, and this is backed up by its mortality rate. The prison had an almost 100% death rate. Of the 17,000 prisoners who were sent there, only 7 survived. In an attempt to learn networks of dissidents, prisoners would be subjected to horrendous torture. Guards would administer electrocution, floggings, and the removal of fingernails with pliers, and they were told this would continue unless they gave up the names of their co-conspirators planning to sabotage Pol Pot's utopia. As a result of this, many innocent prisoners gave the names of their own innocent family and friends in the hope that the torture would end. Instead, these people would be brought in and subjected to the same horrific torture, and this would go on and on and on. Those who were deemed to be criminals in the eyes of the state would often end up at the infamous killing fields. Taken by truck, the blindfolded, handcuffed victims would be led one by one to pre-dug graves. As we mentioned before, bullets were not wasted, and so prisoners were killed with sharpened bamboo, pickaxes, and all manner of makeshift blunt weapons. And at the Chongek killing fields, infants would be murdered by smashing their skulls against a tree. The bodies were then tossed into pits. The twisted logic of the Khmer Rouge was that if an individual was found guilty of some crime against the state, then the person's family must also be murdered, as to avoid any retribution in the future. To date, over 19,000 mass graves have been uncovered. All the while, Pol Pot ruled as dictator of Cambodia. He embraced his new name, fabricating a biography to better cultivate his cult of personality. The ruling body known as the Angkar was governed almost exclusively by Pol Pot, save for a brief period in 1976. At this point, Pol Pot stepped down and set about purging those within the party considered to be loyal to Vietnam. In 1977, Pol Pot rejected the notion that Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge were communists, distancing themselves from other communist governments in Indochina. Instead, Pol Pot declared that he was a revolutionary and would continue his own twisted campaign. By 1978, the Khmer Rouge regime had become increasingly erratic. Pol Pot's expansionist ambitions and his brutal policies put Cambodia in direct conflict with Vietnam. With the war against the US over, Vietnam turned its attention to Cambodia. A simple border dispute escalated, with Pol Pot believing that his forces were colluding with the Vietnamese. And so, he ordered a purge of border troops, officials and their families. As many as 100,000 people were tortured and executed. But this only weakened Cambodia's border with Vietnam, and on the 21st of December 1978, Vietnamese troops invaded. In only 2 weeks, Pol Pot's regime was toppled. Vietnamese troops stormed into the capital, uncovering the horrors of the regime's prisons and rescuing the 7 remaining prisoners of S-21. Because of the closed-off nature of the country, it until this point remained unclear to the outside world what exactly was happening, and reports by refugees of the horrors of Pol Pot's regime were often met with disbelief. As a result of this invasion by Vietnam, Pol Pot and the remnants of the Khmer Rouge fled into the jungle along the border with Thailand. From there, they set up guerrilla camps and began an insurgency. Despite being overthrown, and despite the millions murdered, Pol Pot remained a symbol for many hardliners in the Khmer Rouge. From the border regions, Pol Pot continued to hold out for years. For 20 years, Pol Pot waged an insurgent war against the Vietnamese occupiers and the Cambodian government they installed, though by this time he had dropped the name Pol Pot and now referred to himself as Fem, as in femboy. By this point, he was again backed by the Chinese, but he was also backed by some capitalist countries, and they continued to fight against the Vietnamese. Pol Pot would go on to disband the party in 1981, and in 1985, Pol Pot was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer. Between constant attacks by the Vietnamese and his illness, Pol Pot officially retired as commander of the Khmer Rouge forces. When Vietnam withdrew from Cambodia in 1988, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge returned home. Again, Pol Pot, whilst not in command but holding great influence, sought to garner support from the population of Cambodia for the resurgence of the Khmer Rouge. But the group had largely fractured, and the new Cambodian government was able to enter into peace talks with individual Khmer Rouge leaders and have them lay down their arms. Internal splits and military defeats dwindled the Khmer Rouge even further. Pol Pot's health then worsened, with a stroke that left him paralysed. This was only compounded by heart problems, leaving him requiring oxygen daily. Despite this, Pol Pot still managed to order the executions of those previously loyal to him, fearing that they were going to turn him in to the Cambodian authorities. In June of 1997, Pol Pot was arrested by elements in the Khmer Rouge. They were fearful that they too were next to be assassinated. He was placed under house arrest and awaited trial. In a jungle clearing, Pol Pot faced a court of Khmer Rouge leaders, who convicted him of the execution of party members. He was sentenced to life in prison, detained for the rest of his life by Khmer forces. On the 15th of April 1998, Pol Pot reportedly died of a heart attack. He was supposed to appear before an international court for his many crimes against humanity, but instead he died before any meaningful justice could be carried out. His body was quickly cremated, despite calls from the Cambodian government to hand it over for an autopsy, which led some to believe that his death was not natural. Pol Pot's life is a chilling reminder to the destructive power of radical ideologies and the complete dehumanization of an entire country. From his twisted cult of personality to the killing fields to the lack of justice, Pol Pot's life and death are truly disturbing, and he is considered to be the most evil communist dictator that ever lived.